Chapter 5. Follow. John was troubled as he sat behind his newspaper in the noodle bar, listening to Clyde Shue's meeting with the Australian. He was operating 9,500 kilometres from home, without the knowledge of the Hong Kong authorities, and he was a couple of bodies shy of what he really needed to run his operation. In the UK, a Cherub mission controller can call in extra Cherubs, adult intelligence officers, or police at short notice, even bringing in a team by helicopter if necessary. Out here, there was nothing except a couple of desk-bound MI5 officers at the British Embassy, who John wouldn't have trusted to carry his luggage, let alone conceal the existence of an ultra-secret organisation like Cherub. John's team had spent 6 weeks building up to the moment when they could successfully identify Clyde Shue with a more senior member of Help Earth. But that would all be for nothing if the Australian walked into the crowd and disappeared before being identified. Someone would have to follow him. It couldn't be John himself. He'd be recognised after sitting opposite the Australian in the restaurant. Chloe was back at the apartment coordinating the phone tracking, and there was a chance the Australian had been watching the restaurant for some time and had seen Kerry. That left Kyle and Bruce as the only ones who could do the job. John had told them both to wear protective body armour under their clothing, but he still wasn't comfortable about sending 2 boys after a man who might be carrying a gun. There was also a chance they'd bump into Clyde and get recognised as he left the restaurant. John studied the physically imposing Australian, looking for any obvious sign that he was armed. But he'd been in the intelligence game more than 20 years and wasn't fooling himself. Unless your target is stupid enough to let a weapon bulge through their clothes, there's no way to tell if a man is carrying a gun. At least the potential problem of Kyle and Bruce bumping into Clyde solved itself. The Australian threw a 100 Hong Kong dollar note on the table as he stood up to leave and told Clyde to stay back and pay the waitress. John grabbed his mobile, dialed up Kyle, and kept his voice low. "Where are you?" "We're lurking by a cash machine 50 metres down the road." John's brain tried to turn a dozen contradictory factors into a decision. Kyle spoke tautly. "Come on, John. We've been waiting 6 weeks. Me and Bruce can handle this." John took a deep breath. Help Earth had killed more than 200 people since they first surfaced. This was an exceptional opportunity to crack the organisation open, and the boys were keen to go. "All right," John said, running an anxious hand around the back of his neck. "You're going for it. But no stupid risks, okay? Your mark is tall, 200 centimetres, big shoulders, squashed up nose like a rugby player, blonde hair, side parting, smart suit, rectangular glasses with an orange tint." "Just eyeballing him now," Kyle said. "He's stepping out. How far are we taking this?" John had no basis for making a decision on how dangerous the Australian was. "Kyle, it's down to your training and common sense. There's nothing I can say." "Do we just follow? Or do you want us to take him down?" "Yeah," John said. "If you think you can do it, take him down." He snapped the phone shut and hoped he'd made the right call. Kyle grinned at Bruce as he pocketed his phone. "John's got the jitters, but we're on." "Mission controllers always get the jitters," Bruce shrugged. "I think it's in their job description." "And we've got ourselves a nice easy mark." The Australian's blonde head stood out in the crowd, and because he didn't know Kyle or Bruce, they could follow more closely than John and Kerry had been able to follow Clyde. Still, the boys couldn't get cocky. 2 teenaged Europeans stood out, wandering the streets of Hong Kong after dark. After walking a kilometre, the bobbing blonde head ducked into an underground MTR station, down a flight of steps, and into a gloomy lit ticket hall. The Aussie had a pass and entered through the electronic turnstile. The boys didn't. "Shit," Kyle said, as he headed up to the ticket machine with a hand burrowing down his pocket, looking for change. An elderly man stood in front of them, trying to feed in a $20 note. It was agony watching the note whir in and out, with a red LED flickering above the slot. Finally, the note got sucked in and a paper ticket and a flurry of coins clanked into the dispensing drawer. "Come on, Grandad," Kyle murmured impatiently as the old codger scooped up his change. Bruce pushed in and began feeding his coins. As soon as the first ticket popped out, Kyle grabbed it. He raced through the turnstile and began sprinting down an empty fixed staircase that ran between two crowded escalators. Bruce was 15 seconds behind him, but there was no sign of the Australian when they met up at the bottom. "Oh, which way?" Bruce gasped, as the crowds bustling around them divided off towards platforms for trains heading east and west. "We've got to split," Kyle said anxiously. "You try eastbound." The boys headed through the crowd onto separate platforms. The metro was packed out, and Kyle got jammed into a slow-moving crowd on a short flight of steps leading down to the westbound platform. The crush made it impossible to see anything beyond the head of the person in front, and no amount of pushing was going to help. Bruce had an easier time making it onto the other platform, but a distant rumbling and rush of air meant a train was arriving at any second. If the Aussie was on the platform, he had to identify him fast. Bruce scanned the platform, but couldn't see the distinctive blonde head. To get a better look, he pushed through to a drinks vending machine at the back of the platform, wedged his trainer in the drawer where plastic bottles dropped out, and used it as a step to raise himself above the crowd. It only took a second to spot the blonde head, 50 metres down the platform. Meanwhile, the wind coming through the tunnel was blowing back Bruce's hair, and the two lamps on the front of the incoming train lit up the tunnel. There wasn't time to fetch Kyle. Bruce stumbled forwards as he stepped down, clattering into the back of a rough-looking dude with punkish hair and slashed-up jeans. He turned on Bruce with an angry face. "Watch it, you piece of shit!" Bruce ignored the remark as the train doors slid open. He ploughed into the crowds of people getting off, but only managed to move 15 metres along the platform before having to cut into a carriage as a recorded voice told him to mind the doors. The air-conditioned space was cooler than the stifling interior of the station, and Bruce felt a hint of relief as he grabbed a pole and the train began to move. It was standing room only, but the carriages weren't packed out, so he began moving towards the front of the train, politely asking people to make way. "Sorry, I've lost my auntie. Excuse me, coming through." The design of the Hong Kong metro gave Bruce a huge break. Instead of separate carriages, the train was made up of an unbroken tube with a bendy section every 35 metres to enable it to turn corners. The train was slowing up for the next stop by the time Bruce made it to the front section, which was less crowded than the centre. The Australian had found an empty seat, and as people stood up to get off, Bruce grabbed one for himself, squeezing between two fat ladies 20 metres away from his target. It was close enough to eyeball the Australian, but not so close that the Australian would pay any attention to him. Bruce took out his phone, hoping to contact Kyle, but there was no signal in the tunnel, so he grabbed a discarded newspaper off the shelf behind. The text wasn't English, and while 6 weeks in a Hong Kong school had brought his conversational Cantonese close to the level of a native speaker, he still found the weird little squiggles the language was written in hard work. After a couple of lines, he gave up and stared at a car ad. The Australian stood as the train slowed down for its fifth stop. Bruce had been watching him out of the corner of his eye, and nothing seemed to suggest that he was suspicious. When the train stopped, Bruce and the Australian exited through separate doors. Awkwardly, Bruce was nearer to the exit, so he rested his trainer on a bench and fiddled with the shoelace until the Australian was in front of him. Before giving chase, he pulled on a Nike baseball cap to alter his appearance slightly. At this end of the line, the train ran just a few metres below street level. After passing through the turnstile, the station exit was a short flight of steps up from the platform. They were on a 4-lane road, lined with office blocks and hotels. The sky was now completely black, and the evening breeze had some bite. Apart from a few bars and restaurants, the shops all had their metal shutters pulled down for the night. If he'd had the chance, Bruce would have contacted Chloe back at the apartment to say what was going on. But within 50 metres of the station, the Australian pushed his way through a revolving door and into the lobby of a smart hotel. Bruce followed a few metres after him. The place looked expensive and modern. Moody lighting, abstract art, a slate floor, and black marble columns. There was a rowdy scene in the bar off to one side, as a bunch of tanked-up businessmen watched a horse race on a big screen TV. The Australian headed through the lobby and straight for the elevator. With no idea what floor he was staying on, Bruce had no option but to stand alongside his target and wait. He felt nervous, but if the Australian remembered him from the train, he wasn't showing it. Or maybe he did remember, but wasn't sweating over the presence of a 13-year-old boy. The elevator made a bing-bong sound and the doors slid, revealing a glass-sided lift with a marble floor. Bruce let the Aussie step in and press the button for the 19th floor. As the door closed, Bruce reached towards the buttons and made an "oh" sound, as if to say, "My goodness, we're on the same floor." This was easily the most suspicious thing Bruce had done. But again, the Australian took it in his stride. As the elevator moved slowly up the outside of the hotel, both passengers stared out of the glass sides at the surrounding skyscrapers and the view over Hong Kong Harbour. A giant cruise liner heading for the ocean terminal was ablaze with yellow light. "That's one beautiful rowboat," the Australian said, leaning his giant hands on the leather-padded railing. Bruce was tense and got thrown off balance by the sudden outbreak of conversation. Yeah. Probably stuffed with fat old people, though." The Aussie laughed. "Oh, you're probably right. Whereabouts is that accent from? London?" Bruce shrugged. "My parents came from Wales originally, but my dad works for a bank, and I've lived all over the world." By the time Bruce said this, the elevator had slowed and the doors were splitting open. "Well, good night, son. Enjoy your stay." Bruce stepped out of the elevator and pretended to be confused by the sign with the different room numbers and arrows pointing in 3 directions. The Australian strode past a line of massive cacti and purposefully onwards down a thickly carpeted corridor towards his room. Unfortunately, he didn't have far to walk. Bruce panicked as he looked around and saw that the Australian had stopped outside the second room along and was already pushing his door open. "Hey, mister," Bruce shouted. "I think you dropped this." The man looked mystified as he backed out of the doorway. As Bruce strode quickly towards him, holding out the first random scrap of paper he'd found inside his jacket, he reached into the opposite pocket and slipped a brass knuckle duster over his fingers. The Aussie was a big bugger, and Bruce wasn't taking any chances.